Julie Laing. I'm here to talk to you today about sourdough, and part of the reason that I'm in here is that I love playing with food and sourdough in particular. I run a food blog called Twice as Tasty, and locally I also teach workshops on just about anything that you would find on the blog. The blog is all about how to use all the seeds and the food and things you've been learning about all day long. Once you produce something out of your garden, what to do with it, whether it's eating it fresh, preserving it, freezing it in some way, and then, how to use it in the middle of winter. If you've got a freezer full of zucchini, what are you supposed to do with it midwinter? So those are the kind of things that the blog focuses on, and then the workshops as well. The workshops I teach are all essentially custom workshops. I come to your home, we get together a few of your friends, and we teach you how to make something in your own kitchen with the tools and equipment and space you use every day. So it's all meant to be hugely hands-on and functional. Today's a little less hands-on, and it's a little less about seeds, but we're going to talk about the sourdough anyway, because most anybody who's interested in all the things you've been learning about today, there tends to be an interest in making better bread as well. Why would you go out and buy a commercial loaf if you've just grown these gorgeous heirloom tomatoes, made this fabulous homemade fresh cheese that you're going to throw on top of it? So that's what we're talking about here today. And there are really a lot of advantages to sourdough, some of which may surprise you, some may not. How many in the room already are bakers with yeast? How many bake with yeast? Yeah, and how many of you bake with sourdough? Okay, excellent. So, a lot of the reason that people get excited about sourdough in the first place is they've eaten some real San Francisco sourdough or something from a fresh bakery, and like, oh, this tastes awesome. But another really good reason is that sourdough can also be better for you, health-wise, than other commercial breads you might find, and particularly if you're making your own. It does have some advantages that way. It's also really cheap to make your own bread. And sourdough, surprisingly, is really simple. Once you figure out how to do the process, it really is very simple to do. It also can be really easy and convenient. There are a lot of misconceptions that, to make sourdough, I've got to constantly care for and feed this starter. And, there was an article last year in the New York Times that had a great analogy. They compared sourdough to keeping a turtle. I think people mostly think about sourdough like keeping a dog. You got to let it out. You got to feed it on a regular scale and basis. Sourdough is a little more hands-off if you want to be. You can love it and pet it as much as you want, and then you can stick it in the tank for the weekend and go do your thing and come back, and it'll still be there in the morning. So it really is an easy and convenient thing. And the key reason that all of this happens, the health, the ease, the simplicity, is the long fermentation time. So what I mean by that is because you're fermenting it for a long time, that's what's giving it its flavor. The longer your dough sits, the better the flavor develops. It's also what makes it healthier for you. Studies have found that people have an easier time digesting sourdough, some people do, than they do regular bread. And it's because of the long fermentation, which increases the acidity in the dough and makes it easier. It's already been broken down, essentially, for you in a way before it even gets into your body. So that's a good reason for why the fermentation really is key the longer you let it go. The fermentation is also the reason that it's so simple to make. It takes flour, it takes water, and ultimately it takes time. And fortunately, it's simple time. Once you know the process, it's simple to make, and the hardest thing to do is to not touch it and to just let it do its thing. The hands-on time that it takes is really limited, which is what makes it so easy and convenient. It really can be forgiving of your schedule. And I'm going to talk mostly about starter here today, but if you go onto my blog and you look at the different recipes for sourdough breads, pita bread and chips, pizza dough, things like that, you're going to see that it says, okay, do it and then let it sit for a while, and then do it and let it sit for a while. The numbers are there because it's a recipe I have to post online. The hard and fast rule is you can kind of fudge it and play it, and it'll still do its thing. It still keeps working for you, even if you decide, I got to go out for 2 hours and miss my next folding of my bread. Really, it's the wait time that people have a hard time getting their heads around, especially if you're not used to baking bread at all. But even if you are used to baking it, the fact that you really spend 20 to 30 minutes actively working on a loaf of sourdough bread seems surprising because the overall time is hours and hours that you're letting it ferment and sit. So, yes?
How big of a deal is temperature? Like I keep my house really cold, and will it still rise? Typically what I've done is stick it in the oven.
Yep. Sourdough prefers an ideal temperature of 70 to 85, which obviously none of us around here are doing in the winter unless, we've got some magic heating genie paying our bills. And even in the summer around here, you're likely not going to be keeping your house that warm. But that's where it's going to be its most active. The thing that I love about sourdough is that it still works inactively when it's at cold temperatures and refrigerated temperatures. And so if your house is warm enough that you're comfortable living in it, your sourdough is going to be comfortable living in it as well. It may not work as quickly as your friend who lives in Hawaii and has a 70-degree household because she's turning on the air conditioning every day, but it's going to be just as comfortable in those temperatures.
So give enough time, it will rise.
Yep, it'll get there. Yep, if you've got an active, healthy starter, it'll keep working and chugging away, for sure. So, so I talked about how simple it is, and it really is. It's water and flour, and when you go to make your actual final product is what goes into your starter. When you go to make your bread product, you're going to have some salt in it, but ultimately that's what it breaks down to. There are a few things that are going to help make your sourdough process easier. The first one, of course, is the magic starter. And some other tools that you may or may not have in your kitchen that you might want to consider if you're doing with sourdough are going to be a scale. I use a kitchen scale for a lot of the stuff on my blog, whether I'm processing, canning foods, whether I'm making sourdough, because it's just more accurate to get your weights than it is to be scooping and measuring. Everybody scoops a different cup of flour. So the scale can be really crucial. When you go to bake, particularly bread, but anything that you're going to bake, I love the baking stone. Having a baking stone in your oven is going to make things a whole lot easier, especially with your sourdough. It's a wetter bread and wetter dough, whether it's for pizza dough or for bread dough. And when I'm baking bread, I bake it under a bowl, and that's what gives me my crispy crust and gets it rising straight away. You want to own a bowl that's big enough that it's going to be larger than the final loaf is going to be. Stash that over the top, and if you're used to bread baking where you spray the oven or you put a pan of water in or something like that, you skip all that. You just put the bowl over for the first half of the baking, lift it off for the end to get its final crust. So those are some things that you may or may not have in your kitchen. You can fudge all of it. I've made sourdough bread with just cup by cup because it's a ratio recipe. So if I'm in somebody else's kitchen and I'm making bread for them and they don't have a scale, I can do it with a cup. If you don't have a baking stone, you can bake on a tray. You're not going to get quite of the benefit of the heating of the stone underneath it, but the sourdough is still going to rise. And if you can't come up with a bowl that works, a lot of people are baking in cast iron. If you've got that instead, I've done it with a saucepan, as long as it doesn't have a plastic handle. Flip the thing upside down. Even if it's, even this doesn't quite fully, it sits pretty steady, but it doesn't have to be like a full solid seal. You just find something to cover it and help capture that steam that it's naturally releasing as it rises. But the main thing you're all here to see is not me. It's this guy. This is the starter.
So you say that you bake under a bowl for about the first half.
Yep. When I'm baking bread, I usually have in the oven for about 40 minutes. And I'll run it for about 30 under the bowl. And then I'll pull it off and let it finish. By then, when you pull the bowl off, you'll see it's fully risen. It's already started to crack on the top. And now you're just giving it a little bit of extra color and letting it finish its in the oven process.
So have you made many different types of flour, like rye sourdough, whole wheat sourdough?
I haven't done a lot of straight flours yet. I'm still playing with a straight rye bread, but I do a lot of mixing of flours. My favorite combination for a bread is to do partial white and partial wheat. Sometimes I'll throw a bit of rye into that bread. It's going to make it a little denser. A lot of times what I'm doing is throwing a little bit of rye into my sourdough starter. As you get to know your starter, you'll get used to what texture and thickness it tends to have, what the viscosity of it is. And if it feels like it's flowing a little light, sometimes I'll feed it with some rye to beef it up. It doesn't have as much gluten content, so it's not going to feed as actively as the wheat flour, but it's going to improve my flavor and thicken it back up a little bit. So But yeah, as far as playing with a straight bread with a straight flour, I tend to like to do a mix. I think the flavor's better. And this guy here, it's who you all came to see. I'm going to move vaguely out of my line of sight. Take a peek, pass it around. This is a sourdough starter. Smell it for sure.
What?
I live with
He
it.
lives with it.
Oh.
He knows what it smells like.
Does it just keep growing and growing?
So this one I fed this morning, and it was about half its depth in the jar when I went to feed it this morning. And that's what it's been at room temperature all day. It was sitting in my car for a while I was here at today's event, and that's what it's been doing all day. It gets the nice bubbles, takes off, gets that great tangy smell going on. And like I said, that's water and yeast, essentially, water and flour, essentially, is what's in there. And you let it ferment, you end up with your yeast, you end up with your good-for-you bacteria, and it just keeps feeding itself.
So you didn't put a commercial type starter type of yeast in there?
Nope, this starter is now almost 2 years old.
Oh.
And I got my first starter from a friend, and just exactly what I'm about to talk about. And by now it's my starter. I've been feeding it for 2 years with the flours I prefer, with my local water, with everything like that. It's taken on its own kind of personality based on what I did with it.
Mm-hmm.
But that is one of the big questions is, okay, this is really what you need to get going, and how do you get your hands on it?
Mm-hmm.
You can make your own starter from scratch. It is definitely possible. It can be a little finicky, definitely more finicky than actually using a starter to get it to start to activate. And years and years ago, I tried to make my first one and never really got it to succeed. There's a lot of different techniques and better ideas out there for making it. If you're a Pinterest person, I've got Twice as Tasty on Pinterest, and on my kitchen science board, you'll find a link for some instructions on making your own starter. I believe they're actually using pineapple juice to help give it a jump start and make it ferment more easily that way.
What about potato water?
Potato water is something that some people are throwing in, for sure. Yep, everybody's kind of got a different formula and technique, and you got to kind of find the one that works for you if you're going to start from scratch, and be prepared to play with it. Starting it from scratch is also going to take a little more time to get it to where you can actively use it. So that's why a lot of people are like, well, maybe I'll just go and buy a starter. And you certainly can. There are places out there to buy starters. There are places that offer a lot of different variety of starters. Just on the Cultures for Health website alone, they've got a gluten-free, they've got a rye, they've got a whole wheat. They're going to send you a dehydrated starter, essentially, that you then rehydrate. And it's going to get going a little bit better than if you start it from scratch, because it's already got those yeasts and bacteria and everything that are willing to go just ready to wake up inside. My personal favorite way to get a starter is from somebody you know. Sourdough loves to be shared. The more you feed it, the healthier it is, the more active it is, the better it tastes. So it's not like you're going to the friend and saying, can I have your favorite chocolate bar? You're going to the friend and saying, oh my goodness, I know you need to feed your starter today. Why don't you just give me what you don't need? And it's that easy. You literally take some out, you feed your own starter, you pass off the other. The other, besides the fact that it's going to be free, the other advantage to getting it from a friend is that it's going to be active, vibrant, ready to go. If you've got a friend who's willing to share a starter, chances are they're using it all the time, and you're going to just take it home and start making your first things out of it. That's part of the reason when I teach my workshops, I teach a sourdough workshop, and I give everybody a starter that then goes home with them. We start out a lot of the discussion we're having here today, we move on and we actually make something, because we're half the time we're in somebody's kitchen. And then they go home with their own starter because it's that easy to just slip and buy and share. The other advantage, if you have somebody you know a starter, is they can help you use it. Everybody's starter is going to behave a little bit differently. Mine is, you can get super geeky about it. They've got percentage hydration levels and things like that. Mine is essentially a pretty medium if you're a coffee person, a medium body starter. You've got some that are going to be super stiff, and you've got some that are going to be more liquidy, more sponge-like. So if you've gotten it from somebody, they're going to be able to tell you what recipes work best with them, what techniques work best with them. So that's my personal favorite, but not everybody knows someone with starter dough, although you may be surprised. and you can certainly pick it up and buy it, and especially if you're looking for something specific, then that's the way to go. If you're looking for gluten-free, by all means, start with a commercial gluten-free starter because they're going to get you in the right direction.
And what was that website again?
Cultures for Health. They're one of my favorites for fermentation stuff. They've got a lot of information, a lot of good products. And they've got a whole write-up on there about what's in there. I believe their gluten-free is a rice base. They've got a whole bunch of write-up in there on what's in it, how you use it, continue to keep it gluten-free. Mine's a wheat-based. It's as I said before, it's primarily going to be white and whole wheat flours. I kind of do a mix. I use Wheat Montana. I'm a big fan of doing local as much as I possibly can. They've got some of their wheats in organic. They're all non-GMO. They're all chemical healthy. So I tend to stick with them, and then I'll supplement it, like I said, occasionally with some rye in the starter, but I generally stick to the wheat base, and then I play with all the other flour flavors in my doughs, depending on what I'm making.
So not necessarily for the starter, but when you're making bread, have you found any difference with using bread flour?
Bread flour I stay away from. It's kind of got its own liveliness that just isn't necessary. It's kind of like you'll see, if you look online, you'll find a lot of sourdough recipes where they're still adding baking soda or baking powder. I'll do that if I'm doing a breakfast food, a waffle or a pancake. I'll put in a little bit just for that immediate rise sometimes, especially if I'm making it at the last minute. But most of the time, if you've got an active healthy starter, it's doing its own thing. You don't need to add any of that in there. Or yeast. Some people are still adding dry yeast in with their sourdough. And the goal is to keep it as simple and basic as possible and keep that whole process going.
Doesn't bread flour have more gluten in it?
Bread flour's got more gluten, but you're looking at I'm not the scientist, unfortunately, but you're looking at the ratio of you need enough gluten to keep the sourdough active and feeding and the yeast and bacteria working, but you give them too much gluten and it's like you've just given your dog the high carbohydrate diet and he's just spinning around in circles because he's got too much energy. So you can over-energize it. It's still going to work. It's still going to be fine. To me, it seems like a waste of spending money on bread flour. So the plain old all-purpose or whole wheat flour works fine and does the trick just as well. So yeah, this was fed this morning with Wheat Montana's natural white flour, and that's what it's been doing today. So talked about getting your own. Once you have it, what do you do with it? That's the next question. If you're the lucky person who just has somebody and says, "Here, have some sourdough starter," what do you then go and do with it? Mostly what you do with it is you use it. You have to care for it, but caring for it and using it go hand in hand. And so when you get your sourdough starter home, the first thing you might think is, I want to make some bread. Or, I want to make some pita chips. And you set out on this process of using it. And by doing so, it's going to encourage you to feed it. And it's going to encourage your starter to get better and stronger. So we'll get back to using a little bit and just run through the care process a little bit. Once you've got a starter, the basics are you take from the jar what you need. You put it into the bowl that you're going to use your amount for your recipe. And then you feed the starter with flour and water to get it back to where it was. And then you let it be. You let it sit for a couple hours at room temperature. It starts to get bubbly. Like I said, this guy's been sitting all morning, so he got quite far and risen. And then if you're going to use it straight away, you leave it out at room temperature and let it go. If you're not, you stash it in the fridge until you're ready to use it.
So what you have in there is, the starter that you are making, or if you have that, you're going to use how many cups, or does each recipe tell you how many cups?
It'll depend on your recipe. If you're following my recipes, they're going to tell you how many grams. I'm weighing it all in grams, which is part of why I've got the scale. So we'll just run through it. I recommend when you first start making stuff with sourdough that you start with breakfast or a flatbread. It's going to be a little bit easier process than your full loaf of bread, and it just gives you a chance to get used to, it's like any new kitchen gadget. The first time you want to make it, you don't want to make the fancy wedding cake. You want to make the cake everybody's going to eat at home and doesn't quite care if you knew how to use the icing machine. So I recommend flatbreads and breakfast. They're easy and simple. Flatbreads are anything from a pita bread to a pizza dough. And for the recipes that I have on my blog, the pizza doughs and flatbreads, they all use 200 grams of starter. So what you can do, sit your bowl on here, zero it out. First what you're going to want to do, since this guy's so lively, is we're going to stir him down. And just by doing that, you can see he loses some depth there. So we're ready to send him over. And then we're just going to pour it in here. I get 200 grams worth. And it kind of comes out looking like this. And I got 204, so I'm going to be super precise about it. Stick my fork back in there and grab a little bit out. There we are.
Where did you get your scale?
Scale, Bed Bath & Beyond, years and years ago, so I'm sure they've got them that are slimmer and more efficient. I like having a kitchen scale that does a pretty good weight. I think this goes up to 11 pounds. That helps with my canning. And I like having the one, obviously, that does the grams and the pounds, because I found that the recipes I started with for sourdough were in grams, and I've just been using those. So this is the starter I'm going to use. I'm going to make my flatbread. I'm going to add flour and water to it and get my dough going. And this is what I've got left. And if you can see it, it's all up the sides of the jar now, but there's a little bit left at the bottom. You basically want to have as much left as you're going to feed into it, ideally. At least 100 grams of starter left in your jar at the end of the day. So if you're going to be making a lot of things that are going to overpower your jar, you can start doing your feedings in another bowl or container or something like that. But I'll zero it out again.
So when you did that this morning, you had starter already from your ongoing batch of starter?
Yep, I had.
So you put some starter in with flour and water to make this.
Yep, I did just what I'm doing now. I poured out some starter because I'm going to go home and make some bread tomorrow. And I needed to feed it for you guys to see. And then I set it back on the scale, and I said, okay, I just took out 200 grams of starter. I want to feed it with equal parts flour and water. I add 100 grams of flour and 100 grams of water, and I stir that all in, and away I go with my fed starter. So, got 100 grams of flour there. And this is just tap water. I live down in Creston, and I've got well water. If you live in Whitefish and your water is heavily fluorinated, or even in Kalispell, if you're on city water, you may have some troubles with the fluoride. If you're having troubles and you're using your tap water, that would be the first thing I'd suggest changing up. It can affect how the yeast and activity work. So I'm throwing it all in here. And I'm just going to give it a good stir so it's thoroughly combined.
Does the flavor of the water matter? Like if you were used to distilled versus like regular water?
I don't think so. My natural water out of the well has a pretty high mineral content. It tastes almost soapy when I go to drink it, and doesn't seem to affect the flavor all of the starter. You're going to get that sourdough tang more than you get anything else. The main thing is you get the fluoride and the chlorine, and it's actually some of the sure what the word is I want to use for it, but some of the other nutrients and things that go along with that can affect the water. That seems to be the problem. And
It might kill some bacteria.
it's got to be pretty strong, you know, and around here, if you're on whitefish water, you know, sometimes you stick your nose in it and you can smell it. They've just just treated everything. So that may be strong enough to cause some problems. There's mixed feedback on how big of an issue it is. Some people are like, oh no, if you've got fluoride and chlorine water, don't use it at all. Other people are like, well, try it and see what happens. And it's not likely to kill your starter. The only thing that's really likely to kill a starter is to get it too hot. You were asking about temperature earlier. If you go and stick it in your oven and just, you know, you had your oven on warm for a minute and then you shove it in to warm it up a little bit, and then your kid comes along and fires up the oven to 425 to cook a pizza, that's probably what would kill your starter. But getting it too cold isn't going to be an issue. What you use for flour and water isn't going to be an issue. If it's active and healthy to begin with, then it's going to be just fine.